Winter has a particular quality in the centuries before medicine understood what sickness actually was, and if you have never lain awake beside someone running a fever with no name, it is hard to imagine just how heavy that kind of night could feel. So settle in, get comfortable. Tonight we are going somewhere quiet and true, and I will be here the whole way through. Here is the thing worth sitting with before we go any further. For almost the entire span of human history, if you fell seriously ill, there was a real chance that nobody on Earth could tell you why, and no one within reach who could actually make it stop. Not because people did not care, they cared enormously. Physicians studied for years, families sat up through the night pressing cool cloths to burning skin. But caring and curing are not the same thing, and for thousands of years, the space between them was where so much of human suffering quietly lived. Picture a small stone house on the edge of a village somewhere in 14th century England, the kind of place where smoke curls from a single chimney, and the fields beyond are still dark with frost. Inside, a woman named Agnes kneels beside a low bed where her son lies burning with fever. He is 9 years old. 2 days ago he was running through the yard chasing hens. Now his lips are cracked, his breathing comes in short uneven pulls, and there is a redness spreading along his collarbone that Agnes does not have a word for, only a feeling low and cold that something in her son's body has gone terribly wrong. The village has sent for the local healer, a woman who knows herbs and has delivered half the children in the parish, and she arrives just as the light is failing. She feels the boy's forehead, looks at his eyes, presses 2 fingers to the inside of his wrist. She does not reach for anything resembling what we would now call a diagnosis. Instead, she begins to talk about balance, about the boy's blood running too hot, too thick, about heat that needs to be drawn out before it can do further damage. This is not ignorance in the way we might casually imagine it. It is in fact the most sophisticated medical framework available anywhere in the known world at that time, inherited from physicians who lived more than 1,000 years earlier, refined by scholars across 3 continents taught in the finest universities of the age. And within that framework there is really only one answer to a fever like this. The healer opens a small leather case, removes a blade no longer than a finger, and prepares to open a vein in the boy's arm. Agnes does not stop her. There is no reason to. This is what care looks like. This is the best that centuries of careful observation have managed to produce. I want to be honest with you about something. What happens next in that small stone house we do not know. Some children recovered despite the treatments of their era. Many did not. What we do know from surviving parish registers and burial records across medieval Europe is that a child's illness carried odds that would be almost unthinkable to a parent today, and that mothers like Agnes lived their entire lives inside that uncertainty, watching, waiting, hoping, without ever having the tools to change the outcome. That is the world we are stepping into tonight. Not a world of cruelty and not a world of foolishness, but a world where the human body remained for most of recorded history, a locked room that nobody had quite found the key to, a world where a wound could kill you as surely as a war, where childbirth was one of the most dangerous events a woman would ever survive if she survived it at all. Where a doctor's most confident diagnosis might be built on ideas about the body that had gone essentially unquestioned since the days of ancient Greece and Rome. And what makes this history so quietly remarkable is not simply how much suffering it contains, though it contains a great deal. It is how intelligent, how devoted, how genuinely committed so many people were to solving a problem they did not yet have the instruments to see. Physicians in Baghdad, Cairo, Salerno, and Paris studied anatomy with real seriousness. They wrote enormous medical encyclopedias, some of which remained standard textbooks for over 500 years. They built hospitals, some of the earliest in the world, dedicated purely to the care of the sick, and still for century after century illness remained something that mostly happened to a person, rather than something a person could reliably fight back against. Tonight we are going to walk through that long, aching stretch of history together. We will sit inside the theory of the four humours, the idea that shaped Western medicine for well over 1,000 years, and understand why bleeding a fevered patient made complete sense to some of the most brilliant minds of their time. We will step into the moment when an unnamed sickness arrives that no existing theory can explain, and watch an entire civilization's medical understanding buckle under the weight of something it never saw coming. We will look closely and gently at what surgery actually meant before anesthesia existed, and what it took to survive it. We will listen to the disagreements between physicians who believed disease travelled on bad air, and those who suspected something smaller, something invisible, was passing from person to person centuries before anyone could prove it. And we will meet the quiet reformers, the ones history nearly forgot, who were laughed out of rooms for suggesting something as simple as washing one's hands before touching a wound. What the surviving evidence suggests again and again is a slower, more human story than we often imagine. Not a sudden leap from darkness into modern medicine, but a stretched, uneven climb made by real people working with what little they had, often getting it wrong, occasionally getting it exactly right, and rarely knowing which was which until long after they were gone. Before we go further into that story, if this is the kind of history you've been looking for, the kind told slowly and honestly, without rushing past the parts that matter, take a moment now to subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps this reach more people who might need a quiet story tonight. And if you have a moment, leave a comment letting me know where in the world you are listening from and what drew you to this particular story. I always read them, and I'm always glad to know you are there. Now get comfortable. Let your shoulders drop. There is no need to hold on to anything tonight except the sound of this story. Because to understand what it truly meant to be sick in a world without modern medicine, we have to go back further than Agnes and her son, back past the stone cottages of medieval England into the sun-bleached cities of the ancient Mediterranean, where the very first attempts to explain the human body in a rational, systematic way were beginning to take shape. It is there, among Greek physicians walking the sea-washed streets of Kos and Alexandria, that the story of Western medicine truly begins, not with cures but with questions. Questions about what illness actually was, where it came from, and whether the body so mysterious and so fragile could ever be understood well enough to be saved. The island of Kos sits in the Aegean Sea, warm and dry for most of the year, ringed by low hills and olive groves that have barely changed in shape since antiquity. It is here, sometime around the 5th century before the Common Era, that a physician named Hippocrates begins doing something that had rarely been attempted with any real consistency before him. He starts writing down what he actually observes in his patients, rather than relying only on ritual prayer or the will of the gods to explain why a person grows sick and why another recovers. This matters more than it might first appear. In the world before Hippocrates' illness across much of the ancient Mediterranean was widely understood as a kind of divine punishment or supernatural intrusion, something sent by an offended god, or a malevolent spirit to be addressed through sacrifice, temple sleep, or appeals to priests rather than physicians. Hippocrates and the school of thinkers who gathered around him proposed something quieter but genuinely radical for its time. They suggested that disease had natural causes, that the body could be studied, observed, and understood through reason, the same way a person might study the movement of the stars or the behavior of the tides. Out of this came the idea that would come to dominate medical thinking across most of the known world for the next 2,000 years, an idea so deeply embedded in language and culture that traces of it still linger in the words we use today. The theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, Yellow bile and black bile, four fluids believed to circulate through the human body and whose balance was thought to determine not only physical health but temperament, mood, even personality. A person with too much blood was thought to run hot, energetic, prone to fever. Too much black bile and a person was believed to fall into melancholy, a word that comes directly from the Greek for black bile, and one we still use today without most people realizing they are quoting a 2,000-year-old medical theory every time they say it. Illness in this framework was rarely thought of as an invading enemy the way we might picture it now. It was understood instead as an imbalance, a kind of internal weather system gone slightly wrong. One humour rising too high while another sank too low. And if illness was imbalance, then the logic of treatment followed naturally. Whatever had risen too high needed to be brought back down. Whatever had thickened needed to be thinned. This is precisely the reasoning that would later send a small blade toward the arm of a feverish child in a stone cottage in medieval England, more than 1,000 years after Hippocrates first sat with his patients on the shores of Kos. The idea did not stay confined to Greece, it travelled. It moved through the great library and medical schools of Alexandria, where physicians began the careful, sometimes gruesome work of dissection, mapping the body's interior with a precision that had never before been attempted at such scale. And centuries later it found its most influential voice in a Roman physician named Galen, a man whose ambition and confidence would end up shaping medicine for longer than almost any single individual in human history. Galen served as physician to Roman emperors and before that as doctor to gladiators in the arena at Pergamon, a position that gave him something few physicians of his era ever had access to: a steady, brutal stream of injuries to study up close. Sword wounds, crushed bones, torn muscle. He watched bodies fail and sometimes watched them heal, and from this violent classroom he built an enormous body of medical writing, confident, detailed, and sweeping in scope. Galen did not merely inherit the theory of the four humours, he expanded it, systematized it, and wrote about it with such thoroughness and such absolute certainty that his conclusions would go largely unchallenged in most of Europe and the Islamic world for close to 1,500 years. There is something worth sitting with in that number. 1,500 years is longer than the entire span of time between the fall of Rome and tonight. It means that a physician treating a patient in Renaissance Florence was in most meaningful respects working from the same basic medical framework as a physician in the Roman Empire more than 1,000 years earlier. Textbooks changed hands. Empires rose and collapsed, entire religions reshaped the map of the known world, and still, underneath most of it, the four humours quietly persisted as the working theory of the human body. What is easy to miss? Looking back from where we sit now is how genuinely reasonable this all seemed at the time. Scholars still debate exactly why Galen's authority proved so difficult to challenge for so long, but part of the answer likely lies in how internally consistent his system was. It explained fevers, it explained fatigue, it explained why certain treatments seemed to help some patients and not others, since no two people were thought to have quite the same natural balance of humours to begin with. It gave physicians a language, a set of tools, and a sense of confident authority in a profession that desperately needed all three. The system was wrong in ways we now understand clearly, but it was not stupid, and the people who practiced within it were not fools. They were working carefully and seriously with the best framework available to them, the way any of us might. Here is a detail that tends to surprise people when they first hear it. Some of the most advanced medical thinking of this entire era was not happening in Europe at all, but flourishing in the Islamic world in cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo during a period historians often call the Islamic Golden Age. Physicians there did not merely preserve Galen's work while Europe drifted through what is sometimes called the early medieval period. They actively expanded it, corrected some of its errors through careful clinical observation, and built institutions that a modern visitor might genuinely recognize as hospitals in the fuller sense of the word. A physician named Ibn Sina, known in the Latin-speaking world as Avicenna, compiled a medical encyclopedia so comprehensive that it remained a required text in European universities for several centuries after his death, translated and retranslated, studied by physicians who likely never fully realized how much of their own medical education had passed, first through Arabic scholarship before ever reaching them in Latin. And yet for all of this genuine sophistication, for all of the careful observation and honest intellectual effort poured into understanding the human body, there remained a hidden contradiction sitting quietly at the center of the entire system, one that would take many more centuries to fully surface. The four humours theory was built almost entirely on reasoning from observed symptoms outward, rather than from any real understanding of what was happening inside the body at a microscopic level, because the instruments needed to see that level of detail simply did not exist yet. Physicians could watch a fever rise and fall, they could not see the infection driving it. They could observe that wounds sometimes healed cleanly and sometimes turned fatal without any way of knowing that invisible organisms, far too small for any eye of that era to detect, were often the true difference between the two outcomes. The system had no concept of contagion in the way we understand it now, no framework at all for something like bacteria or viruses, because there was quite literally nothing in the available evidence of the time that could have led anyone toward that idea. This gap between what could be observed and what was actually happening beneath the surface would go on to shape almost everything we are going to walk through together tonight. It explains why a genuinely brilliant physician might bleed a patient nearly to the point of collapse in the sincere belief that they were helping. It explains why the boundary between medicine and religion remained so blurred for so long, since anything the theory of the four humours could not account for tended to be quietly folded back into questions of divine will or moral failing. And it explains why when something arrives that the four humours framework has absolutely no answer, for something moving faster and killing more widely than any illness Europe has recorded in living memory. The entire structure of medical confidence built up over more than a millennium is about to be tested in a way it was never designed to survive. In October of the year 1347, 12 ships drift into the harbour at Messina on the eastern coast of Sicily. They have sailed from the Black Sea from a trading post called Caffa, and to the dock workers watching them approach, something about their arrival feels wrong before anyone can say exactly why. The ships move strangely, sails poorly tended, and when officials finally board to inspect them, they find most of the sailors already dead at their oars. The handful still breathing are covered in dark swellings, the size of eggs, some the size of apples, clustered beneath their arms and along their necks, and burning with a fever that seems to consume them from somewhere deep inside. The authorities in Messina do the only thing they can think to do. They order the ships back out to sea. It does not matter. Whatever has travelled on those 12 vessels has already stepped onto the docks, already moved into the taverns and warehouses and narrow streets of the port, and within days the sickness the ships carried is no longer a rumour from the sea. It is inside the city. This is the moment that historians now recognise as one of the true hinge points of the medieval world, the arrival in Europe of what would come to be called the Black Death. Though the people living through it had no such name for it yet, they only had the sickness itself spreading with a speed that nothing in living memory, nothing in any physician's training, nothing in the accumulated 1500 years of humoral medicine we spent time with a moment ago had prepared anyone to face. Within about 2 years, this illness will move from Sicily through nearly every corner of Europe, from the Mediterranean coastline up through France into England, across the Holy Roman Empire into Scandinavia and Russia, following trade routes and river valleys with a kind of terrible efficiency. And when it is finished, somewhere between a third and perhaps as much as half of the entire population of Europe will be gone. Historians still debate the precise figures, since record-keeping varied enormously from region to region, and many of the dead in the worst-hit areas were buried too quickly and in numbers too large for anyone to count with real accuracy. But even the most conservative modern estimates describe a death toll almost impossible to hold in the mind tens of millions of people in a world with a fraction of today's population gone within the span of a few short years. What makes this moment so important to the story we are telling tonight is not simply the scale of the dying, staggering as it is what this illness did to the confidence of medicine itself. Because here is a sickness that by every observable measure does not behave the way an imbalance of humours is supposed to behave. It does not respond to bleeding. It does not respond to purging or to careful adjustments of diet and rest. It seems to leap from person to person, from household to household, sometimes from an entire town to the next town over, in a way that has no clear explanation within the framework physicians have relied upon for over a millennium. Picture a physician in Florence, one of the most sophisticated medical centres in Europe at the time, home to some of the best trained doctors of the age. He has studied Galen. He has studied Avicenna. He understands the theory of the four humours as thoroughly as anyone alive, and now he stands in a home where 3 family members have died within the same week, where the swellings have appeared and spread and turned black, and where every treatment his training has given him has done nothing at all to slow what is happening. This is a profession built on the belief that illness, however frightening, could ultimately be understood and managed through careful reasoning. And here, for the first time in longer than anyone can remember, that belief is failing in full public view. The dominant medical explanation that takes hold across much of Europe is something called miasma theory, the idea that this illness, like many others, travels through bad air, corrupted by decay, by the alignment of the planets, by swamps and rot and unclean vapours rising from the earth. It is not an unreasonable theory given what was actually observable at the time. Areas with poor sanitation and standing water did tend to see worse outbreaks of many illnesses, which seemed to lend the theory a kind of circumstantial support. Physicians in the worst affected cities began wearing long leather robes and wide-brimmed hats, and eventually a version of the beaked mask that has since become one of the most recognizable images from this entire era. Its long beak stuffed with dried flowers, herbs, and spices, worn in the sincere belief that filtering the bad air itself might offer some protection. What the evidence actually shows, and this is a detail that surprises a lot of people when they first learn it, is that the beaked plague mask, most commonly pictured in illustrations from this period, is very likely a later invention refined and popularized by a French physician working more than 2 centuries after the worst of the Black Death had already passed. The mask people now most associate with the 14th century plague doctor was really a creation of the 1600s, retroactively layered onto our collective memory of an earlier crisis. It is a small reminder of how much of what feels certain about the past has actually been shaped, reshaped, and sometimes quietly invented by the centuries that came after it. What people at the time could not have known, and what would not be understood with any real scientific certainty for another 500 years, is that the illness moving through their cities was very likely caused by a bacterium carried primarily by fleas, which in turn were carried by rats, creatures that travelled easily on the same ships and along the same trade routes that carried grain, cloth and spice across the medieval world. The disease did not ride on bad air at all. It rode on commerce. It rode on the very trade networks that had made cities like Florence and Venice and London wealthy and connected in the first place, which meant that the very thing built to bring prosperity into these cities was, without anyone realizing it, also the thing bringing death. I want to pause here because there is a genuine scholarly debate worth acknowledging honestly. While the bacterial explanation remains the most widely accepted reconstruction of what caused the Black Death, some historians and scientists have raised questions over the years about whether a single pathogen fully accounts for how fast and how widely this illness spread, given how differently it seemed to behave in different regions. Modern genetic analysis of remains from mass burial pits has strengthened the case considerably in recent years. But the picture, as with so much from this distant a period, is not entirely without its open questions. What is not in question is what this crisis did to the people living through it and to the institutions meant to protect them. Physicians, priests, and civic leaders alike found themselves without answers in a moment when people needed answers more desperately than almost any other point in medieval history. Some responded with genuine, careful effort, isolating the sick as best they understood how tending to patients despite watching colleague after colleague fall ill themselves. Others responded very differently. Entire communities turned to blame. Certain religious and ethnic minorities across parts of Europe were accused of poisoning wells or somehow summoning the illness accusations that led to real and terrible violence layered on top of a crisis that was already devastating enough on its own. Fear. When it has nowhere reasonable to land, tends to find somewhere unreasonable instead. And this period offers one of history's clearest and most painful illustrations of exactly that pattern. And there is a quieter, more human detail worth sitting with before we move forward, one easy to lose beneath the scale of the numbers. In towns and villages across Europe, ordinary people began keeping their own informal records of loss scratched into parish ledgers mentioned briefly in surviving letters, a mother writing to a relative in another town, simply to say that she was for now still alive. Historians studying these fragments have found something remarkably consistent across very different regions, a kind of quiet, exhausted endurance running underneath the terror. People buried their dead, they mourned, they kept tending their fields and their animals and their remaining children because there was in the end nothing else to do but continue. The scale of the Black Death can make it feel almost abstract, a statistic too large to really absorb, but it was in every single case one specific person's fever, one specific family's grief repeated across an almost unimaginable number of homes. By the time the worst of this wave finally recedes, in the early 1350s, Europe is a fundamentally changed place, not only in population but in its relationship to illness itself. The old confidence, the sense that a well-trained physician working from Galen's careful reasoning could ultimately explain and manage whatever sickness arrived, has been shaken in a way it will never fully recover from. And in the decades that follow, as the immediate terror slowly eases, something else begins to stir quietly beneath the surface of medicine, a set of questions that had never needed asking quite so urgently before. If bleeding a patient does not help, if prayer alone does not stop the dying, if bad air cannot fully explain why one household falls and the house beside it does not, then what precisely has been happening inside the human body all along? That question will not be answered quickly. It will take centuries, and it will demand treatments and practices that, looked at closely, are almost harder to sit with than the illness itself. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a household once the fever has broken and the swellings have receded, at least in the households where that happens at all, and it is in this quieter aftermath in the decades following the worst waves of plague that something shifts in how Europe approaches the sick body. Not because anyone has discovered what truly causes illness, that understanding is still centuries away, but because the scale of the disaster has forced physicians, however reluctantly, to admit that the old confidence was not enough, and admitting that is often the first uncomfortable step toward anything resembling progress. What emerges in the years that follow is not a wholesale abandonment of humoral theory. That would take far longer than a single crisis to accomplish. What emerges instead is an intensification of its most physical, most direct interventions, a growing belief that if gentler methods of restoring balance have failed so visibly, then perhaps more forceful methods are needed, And so bloodletting, already a familiar practice, becomes even more deeply embedded into the routine of medical care, not reserved only for serious fevers, but recommended for an enormous range of conditions: headaches, fatigue, melancholy, even simple seasonal changes believed to disturb the body's internal balance. To understand what this actually meant for an ordinary patient, it helps to picture the tools involved, because they were remarkably unremarkable. A small blade called a lancet, little more than a sharpened sliver of metal used to open a vein, most often at the inside of the elbow or the back of the hand. Blood would be collected in a shallow bowl, and the amount drawn was often measured with real precision. Physicians of the period frequently recorded exact quantities in ounces, believing that careful measurement was itself a mark of medical seriousness. In more severe cases, a patient might be bled repeatedly over the course of several days, sometimes losing what modern medicine would recognize as a genuinely dangerous proportion of their total blood volume, all in the sincere pursuit of restoring an internal balance that we now understand was never actually the true source of their illness in the first place. Here is a detail that tends to surprise people. Bloodletting was not considered a treatment reserved for the desperately ill or the poor without access to better care. Quite the opposite. It was for centuries a treatment favoured by royalty and the wealthiest households in Europe, precisely because it required a trained practitioner and was seen as a mark of serious attentive medicine. Several European monarchs were bled regularly as a matter of preventive health, a kind of routine maintenance for the body, the same way a person today might get an annual physical. The idea that opening a vein and removing blood could somehow prevent illness before it even began speaks to just how deeply this framework had settled into the medical imagination across every level of society, and bleeding was only one tool among several built on the same underlying logic. Purging the deliberate inducement of vomiting or diarrhea through various herbal preparations was used just as widely based on the same belief that illness resulted from an excess needing to be expelled. Cupping in which a heated glass vessel was placed against the skin to draw blood toward the surface as it cooled was used to target specific areas of pain or swelling, and in certain cases involving severe headaches, seizures, or conditions we would now recognize as neurological or psychiatric, physicians turned to an even older and more startling practice, one that predates even Hippocrates by thousands of years, a procedure known as trepanation, the careful drilling or scraping of a small hole into the skull intended to relieve pressure or release whatever was believed to be trapped inside. What the archaeological evidence shows about trepanation is genuinely remarkable and worth sitting with for a moment. Skulls recovered from sites across Europe, and in fact from far earlier periods and far more distant regions than most people expect, sometimes show clear signs of healing around the edges of the hole, meaning the patient survived the procedure in some cases for years afterward. Scholars still debate exactly how ancient practitioners managed infection rates well enough for this level of survival to occur with any regularity, since sterile technique in the modern sense simply did not exist. Some researchers suggest that certain plant-based preparations used to clean wounds may have had genuine, if only partially understood, antiseptic properties, offering an accidental layer of protection that practitioners could not have explained but had nonetheless stumbled into through generations of trial and observation. This is in many ways the quiet undercurrent running through this entire era of medicine, and it is worth pausing on directly. Not every treatment born from mistaken theory was entirely without value. Some herbal preparations used for centuries under the language of humoral balance did in fact contain compounds with real medicinal effects that practitioners could observe and rely upon without ever understanding the underlying chemistry that made them work. Willow bark, chewed or brewed for pain and fever, for thousands of years across many different cultures, contains a compound chemically related to what we now know as aspirin. The physicians prescribing it had no concept of salicylic acid or its effect on inflammation. They only knew through generations of careful repeated observation that it seemed to help, and they kept using it, theory or no theory, because the results were consistent enough to trust. What this tells us is something worth carrying forward as we continue through tonight's story. The relationship between medical theory and medical practice during this era was often far less tidy than we might assume. Physicians were in a very real sense running enormous uncontrolled experiments across entire populations for century after century, and some of what emerged from that long, difficult process of trial and error genuinely worked, even when the explanation attached to it was, by modern understanding, almost entirely mistaken. Progress and error were not opposites in this period. They were tangled together, inseparable, moving forward at the same uneven pace. But it would be its own kind of dishonesty to let that observation soften what these treatments actually cost the people who endured them. For every patient who happened to receive a genuinely effective herbal remedy, there were countless others weakened rather than helped by aggressive bleeding, made more vulnerable to infection, by repeated purging left with wounds from procedures performed with instruments cleaned at best with wine or vinegar, and at worst, not cleaned at all between patients. The physicians of this era were not careless, and they were rarely cruel by intention, but they were operating inside a system that had no reliable way of distinguishing its genuine successes from its quiet failures. No method for testing one treatment against another in any way we would recognize today, which meant that a confident diagnosis and a confident cure could be delivered with exactly the same certainty, whether or not either one actually held any truth. And where would this uncertain, uneven relationship between care and harm become more starkly visible than in a setting? Most people rarely think to associate with medicine's darker chapters at all, a place meant to bring life into the world rather than take it away, where the hands trying hardest to help would for a very long time remain among the most dangerous a woman could encounter. A birthing room in the early 1600s looks nothing like a hospital, because it is not one. It is usually a bedroom curtained and warm, sometimes deliberately darkened, attended not by physicians but by women. A midwife at the centre of it all, surrounded by neighbours and relatives who have likely attended dozens of births before this one, and will attend dozens more after it. There is a particular kind of expertise held in that room, passed down through generations of women who learned by watching, by doing, by sitting through the long hours of labour beside mothers who trusted them completely because there was in truth very little else available to trust. And yet for all of that accumulated skill, childbirth during this period remains one of the most dangerous events a woman will ever live through. A fact so widely understood at the time that many women, on learning they were pregnant, quietly began putting their affairs in order, the same way a person today might update a will before a long journey with an uncertain outcome. Historians studying surviving records from early modern Europe have found maternal mortality rates that are difficult to fully translate into modern terms, but the reality sits somewhere close to this across a woman's full childbearing years. The cumulative risk of dying in connection with pregnancy or birth could rival the risk faced by a soldier across an entire military campaign. This was simply understood as part of what it meant to build a family in this era, a danger accepted quietly, almost without comment because there was no alternative. What most often threatened a mother's life was not any singular dramatic complication, but something far quieter and in its own way more troubling. Infection arriving in the hours or days following birth, a condition once known as childbed fever, which could turn a successful delivery into a fatal one within a matter of days. And here is where the story circles back to something we touched on earlier, without anyone in that birthing room having the faintest way of knowing it. The very hands attending the birth, however skilled, however gentle, however genuinely devoted to the mother's welfare, were in many cases the thing carrying the danger into the room in the first place. This will not be fully understood or even seriously suspected for another 200 years. We will sit with that story properly before tonight is through, because it is one of the more quietly devastating chapters in this entire history. A story about a man who came remarkably close to the truth and was punished for it rather than believed. For now, it is enough to hold this thought gently in mind as we move forward. The era we are walking through together was one in which the desire to help and the capacity to cause harm often lived inside the very same well-meaning hands, without anyone involved having any way of telling the two apart. If childbirth carried this kind of quiet, ever-present risk surgery when it became unavoidable was something else, again a confrontation with the body that most people of this era approached the way a person might approach walking into open flame. Not because surgeons were reckless. Many were highly skilled within the narrow boundaries of what their era allowed. But because surgery before the middle of the 1800s meant something almost unimaginable to us now, it meant being fully conscious for the entirety of the procedure. Picture what an amputation actually involved during this period, because the details matter, and understanding them honestly is part of what this channel exists to do. A patient, often a soldier wounded in battle, or a labourer whose limb had been crushed in an accident, would be brought to a surgeon, sometimes in a dedicated surgical theatre, more often on whatever table or door happened to be available. Several strong men were needed simply to hold the patient still, because there was no anaesthesia, no way to dull the pain beyond at best a heavy dose of alcohol, or in some cases opium, neither of which came close to eliminating what the patient was about to feel. A skilled surgeon prized speed above almost everything else, not out of carelessness, but out of genuine mercy. The fastest surgeons of this era could complete a full leg amputation in under a minute, understanding correctly that every additional second was a second of unbearable suffering for the person on the nipple. There is a detail here that tends to genuinely surprise people, and it says something quietly remarkable about human resilience. Surviving accounts from patients who underwent surgery during this era. Soldiers' memoirs, letters, the occasional surgeon's own case notes, describe an experience of pain so total that some patients later reported a kind of dissociation, a sense of watching the procedure happen almost from outside their own body, the mind's own limited, imperfect way of protecting itself, when there was nothing else available to offer protection. Scholars studying these accounts still debate how common this dissociative response actually was, since so much of the surviving evidence comes from a relatively small number of literate patients whose experiences were considered worth recording in the first place, which means the full range of what ordinary people endured during this era is very likely lost to us entirely. The surgeons performing these operations were in many respects a different professional class, entirely from the physicians we spent time with earlier in this story, and this distinction is worth sitting with, because it reveals something surprising about how medicine was actually organized during this period. Physicians trained at universities steeped in Galen and the theory of the four humours largely considered surgery beneath their station, a matter of manual labour rather than intellectual medicine. For centuries across much of Europe, surgery was instead performed by a separate guild entirely, one that remarkably shared its professional origins with an entirely different trade: barbers. The barber surgeon is not a strange bit of trivia invented for effect. It reflects a genuine and long-standing arrangement across medieval and early modern Europe, in which the same tradesman who trimmed your hair and shaved your face might also on a different day pull your rotten tooth, set your broken bone lance, an infected wound, or amputate a shattered limb, all requiring the same basic skill of working confidently and precisely with a sharp blade. The red and white striped pole still seen outside of barber shops today, one of the most enduring visual symbols in Western commercial life, actually descends directly from this history, originally representing blood and the bandages used to bind a wound, a small, mostly unnoticed fossil of an entire vanished medical profession, still spinning quietly on street corners in cities all over the world. What made surgery survivable at all when it was survivable had far less to do with skill in the operating moment and far more to do with what happened afterward in the days following the procedure, when infection posed the greatest ongoing threat to a patient's life. And here the record shows something genuinely uncomfortable to sit with. Surgical instruments during most of this period were not sterilized in any sense we would recognize today, because the underlying reason sterilization mattered. The presence of invisible microorganisms capable of causing infection was not yet understood by anyone anywhere. A surgeon might wipe a blade between patients more out of a rough sense of order than any theory of contamination. Wound dressings were sometimes packed with substances intended to draw out what was believed to be corrupted matter, occasionally including ingredients that, considered honestly by modern medical standards, likely introduced more risk of infection than they ever prevented. And yet even here in this genuinely difficult chapter, there are threads of real hard-won skill worth honouring. Military surgeons in particular, forced by the sheer volume of casualties they treated, across centuries of warfare developed techniques for managing wounds, controlling bleeding, and even performing early tentative versions of reconstructive procedures that were within their limits genuinely effective. A French military surgeon working in the 1500s, treating soldiers wounded by early firearms, quietly abandoned the standard and extremely painful practice of the era, pouring boiling oil directly into gunshot wounds in favor of a much gentler wound dressing, after happening to notice almost by accident one night when he ran out of oil that his patients treated with the gentler method were resting more comfortably, and it would turn out actually healing better than those treated according to established practice. It is a small, human moment of quiet observation, overturning centuries of accepted wisdom, and it is worth remembering that some of the most meaningful medical progress in this entire era did not come from grand theory at all, but from ordinary people paying close, honest attention to what they were actually seeing in front of them. Because that in the end is the thread running through nearly everything we have walked through together so far tonight. Progress in this era rarely arrived as a single dramatic breakthrough. It arrived slowly, unevenly, often by accident, carried forward by individuals willing to notice when the accepted answer simply was not matching the reality in front of them. And as we continue moving through this history together, we are about to meet some of those people directly, the ones who look closely enough and stayed curious enough to begin asking a question that had gone almost entirely unasked for far too long. Not what does the theory say should be happening inside the body, but what is actually happening, and how would we even begin to see it clearly enough to know for certain? There is a particular kind of stillness in an archive room, the kind found in the basement of an old cathedral in England, or a municipal records office in a small Italian town where centuries of parish ledgers sit bound in cracked leather, their pages brittle enough that archivists turn them wearing thin, cotton gloves. It is in rooms like this, far removed from any operating table or sickbed, that much of what we actually know about illness in the centuries we have been walking through together tonight has quietly survived. Not in grand medical treatises alone, though those matter too, but in something far more ordinary. Lists, names, dates of birth, dates of death written in the careful, cramped hand of a parish clerk who almost certainly never imagined that anyone centuries later would comb through his entries searching for the shape of a vanished epidemic. These records are called parish registers, and their systematic keeping across much of England began in the 1500s under a requirement that every church record every baptism, marriage, and burial within its community. What started as a fairly mundane bureaucratic exercise has become in the hands of modern historians and demographers something closer to an accidental time machine. By counting burials month by month across a given parish, researchers can trace the rise and fall of mortality with a precision that would have been impossible to reconstruct from surviving medical opinion alone since physicians of the era. As we've already seen, we're often working from theories that told them very little about what was actually happening inside the body. The clerk recording a burial did not need a correct diagnosis. He only needed to write a name and a date, and in doing so without ever intending to, he left behind a kind of evidence far more reliable than most of what medicine itself could offer at the time. What these registers reveal when historians line up hundreds of them across different regions and different decades is a portrait of mortality that shifts and spikes in ways that often align closely with outbreaks we know from other sources and sometimes reveal outbreaks that left almost no other trace at all. A sudden sharp rise in burials in a single summer month concentrated heavily among infants and the elderly tends to point toward one kind of illness. A rise spread more evenly across every age group, arriving with unusual speed and receding just as quickly tends to point toward another. Historians and epidemiologists working together on this kind of evidence have in recent decades been able to identify patterns consistent with dysentery, typhus, smallpox, and influenza, moving through specific communities centuries before anyone in those communities had any real understanding of what they were facing, simply by reading the quiet arithmetic of birth and death left behind in these old careful hands. Bones tell a different kind of story and in some ways an even more intimate one. Archaeologists excavating medieval cemeteries, plague pits, and even ordinary churchyards have learned to read skeletal remains for signs of illness and injury that would otherwise have been lost entirely to time. A bone that has healed after a fracture shows the accumulated pattern of a life. Lesions on certain bones can indicate chronic infections that lingered for years before eventually contributing to death. Dental evidence in particular offers something remarkably direct, since teeth preserve a kind of biological diary recording. Periods of childhood malnutrition or illness as faint horizontal lines in the enamel, permanent markers laid down during moments of severe physical stress that a person may have experienced as a young child and carried unknowingly in their own mouth for the rest of their life. Here is a detail that surprises most people the first time they hear it. Some of the most significant recent breakthroughs in understanding historical disease have not come from old documents at all, but from something almost unimaginable to the people who first died from these illnesses. Deep within the tooth, in a small chamber called the dental pulp, DNA can sometimes survive remarkably well for centuries, protected from the environment in a way that soft tissue never could be. In the past 2 decades, scientists working with remains from medieval mass burial pits, including several linked directly to the Black Death, we sat with earlier tonight, have extracted genetic material from these teeth and used it to identify with a level of confidence unimaginable to any physician of the period the actual pathogen responsible for what these people endured. It is one of the quieter, more remarkable reversals in this entire history. The very people who died without ever knowing what killed them have centuries later ended up teaching us the answer themselves through evidence carried silently inside their own bodies the whole time. And yet even with tools, this precise the picture that emerges from bones and registers is never quite complete, and it is worth being honest about that rather than presenting this evidence as though it resolves every open question. Skeletal remains can reveal that someone suffered from a chronic illness, but they cannot always reveal exactly which illness, since many different conditions leave broadly similar marks on bone. Parish registers, meanwhile, are only as reliable as the communities that kept them, and enormous portions of the historical record, particularly outside Europe, particularly among poorer, more marginalized communities everywhere, were simply never written down at all, or have not survived the intervening centuries. Scholars studying this period are careful to acknowledge that what we know is shaped as much by what happened to survive as by what actually happened, and that the true scale of suffering in eras like this one likely exceeds what any surviving document or bone could ever fully capture on its own. Is it possible then that entire epidemics, entire waves of loss experienced by communities whose records were never kept or were later lost, have simply vanished from history altogether, leaving no trace for anyone to ever find? It is not only possible. Most historians working in this field consider it almost certain. What makes this evidence so valuable despite its gaps is the way it lets us check the confident claims of historical medicine against something closer to physical reality. A medieval medical text might describe a treatment with total certainty, but a burial register from the same town, the same decade, can show us with cold and simple clarity whether that certainty actually translated into survival. In town after town where outbreaks of serious illness struck during this era, the registers tell largely the same story regardless of which particular treatments local physicians favoured, regardless of how confidently those physicians wrote about their own methods in surviving letters and casebooks. The dying continued at roughly the same devastating pace almost everywhere, a quiet, patient kind of evidence suggesting that the treatments themselves, however earnestly applied, were doing far less than anyone practicing them believed. There is one further kind of evidence worth mentioning before we move forward, because it complicates the picture in an interesting way, adding a layer of nuance easy to miss. Not every historical treatment failed to help, and the physical record occasionally shows this clearly. Isotopic analysis of bones from certain monastic hospitals in medieval England, where care included regular access to reasonably clean water, better nutrition than most surrounding communities could afford, and rest in a controlled environment, away from the crowded conditions of ordinary town life, shows survival rates for certain conditions that were measurably better than in the wider population, not because the physicians in these institutions possessed some secret superior medical theory. Their understanding of the body was largely the same as anyone else's at the time, but because rest, clean water and basic nutrition turn out to matter enormously to recovery, regardless of whether the people providing them understood exactly why. It is a small, almost understated finding, easy to walk past, but it carries real weight. It suggests that care itself, quiet, consistent, attentive care, offered real protection during this era, even in the near-total absence of anything resembling modern medical knowledge, and that some of the gentlest, most overlooked interventions of the period may have quietly saved more lives than any of the era's more dramatic and confident treatments ever did. All of this evidence, the ledgers, the bones, the careful genetic traces left behind in ancient teeth, builds towards something larger than simply confirming what we already suspected about how brutal this era of illness truly was. It builds toward a genuine, ongoing scientific mystery, one that historians and scientists are still actively working to untangle even now, involving not just how people in this era died, but how the very theories meant to explain their deaths came to be so thoroughly and confidently believed for so long, despite mounting evidence visible even to observant people at the time that something in the reasoning simply did not add up. Faith and medicine in the world we have been walking through together tonight were never fully separate things, and nowhere does that overlap become more visible than in how communities responded when illness arrived faster and more devastatingly than any physician could explain. When the swellings and fevers of plague moved through a town with no apparent pattern striking one household, while leaving the neighbouring house entirely untouched, many people naturally reached for the explanation that had always been available even before Hippocrates first began asking his careful, rational questions on the island of Kos: divine punishment. A wrathful god offended by the moral failings of a sinful world delivering judgment on the innocent and guilty alike. This was not a fringe belief held only by the uneducated. It sat comfortably alongside and often blended directly into the medical theories we have already spent time with. A physician could genuinely believe both that a patient's suffering stemmed from an imbalance of the four humours and that the underlying cause of the epidemic itself was a form of divine chastisement sent to correct the moral direction of an entire society. These were not seen as contradictory explanations occupying different categories of thought. In a worldview where God was understood to govern every part of creation, including the natural laws that made bodies sicken and heal, medicine and religion were simply two languages describing the same unfolding reality. This belief produced some of the most striking and to modernize unsettling responses to plague anywhere in this history. Across parts of Europe during the worst outbreaks of the Black Death, groups of penitents known as flagellants formed processions that moved from town to town, whipping their own bare backs with knotted cords in public displays of repentance, believing that if enough suffering could be offered up voluntarily, it might satisfy whatever divine anger had unleashed the plague in the first place. These processions, sometimes numbered in the hundreds, moving through city streets chanting hymns, drawing enormous crowds who watched with a mixture of horror sympathy and desperate hope that this finally might be the thing that made the dying stop. What tends to surprise people learning about this movement for the first time is how quickly it became a source of concern, not just for civic authorities worried about public order, but for the Church itself. Pope Clement VI, reigning during the worst years of the plague, eventually condemned the flagellant movement, worried that its increasingly independent, self-organized nature operating outside normal church hierarchy posed a genuine threat to religious authority. There is something almost startling in that fact worth sitting with for a moment, even inside an explanation built entirely around divine judgment. The Church itself grew wary of a response to that judgment. It could not fully control a reminder that fear, once it takes hold of a population, rarely stays confined within any single institution's boundaries, religious or medical alike. Alongside divine punishment and the miasma theory we touched on earlier tonight, a third explanation was quietly taking shape during this same period. One that would eventually prove far closer to the truth than either of the others, though it would take centuries for that fact to be widely accepted. The idea of contagion, the notion that illness itself as a physical substance or agent could pass directly from one person to another. This idea was not entirely new. Ancient physicians had occasionally speculated about something resembling contagion, noticing that certain illnesses seemed to cluster around close contact between the sick and the healthy, but it found its clearest and most influential early expression in the work of an Italian physician and scholar named Girolamo Fracastoro, writing in the 1500s, roughly 2 centuries after the worst waves of the Black Death had already passed through Europe. Fracastoro proposed something remarkably close to modern germ theory, suggesting that disease spread through tiny invisible particles he called seminaria, or seeds of contagion capable of passing from person to person directly through contaminated objects or even across short distances through the air. What makes Fracastoro's theory so quietly remarkable is how much he got right using nothing but careful reasoning and observation centuries, before anyone possessed a microscope powerful enough to actually see the microorganisms he was essentially describing in theory alone. He distinguished correctly between illnesses that seemed to require direct physical contact and those that seemed to spread more freely through the air or through shared objects like clothing and bedding, a distinction that maps remarkably well onto the real difference between contact-transmitted and airborne pathogens as we understand them today. And yet for all of this genuine insight, Fracastoro's theory did not replace miasma theory or displace the idea of divine punishment in any decisive way. It simply became a third competing explanation argued over, partially accepted, partially dismissed, existing alongside the older theories for generations rather than clearly triumphing over them. Why did an idea this close to the eventual truth take so long to be widely accepted? Scholars still debate the full answer, but part of it likely comes down to a genuinely difficult problem. Fracastoro could describe his seeds of contagion in careful, reasoned language, but he could not show anyone actual physical evidence that they existed. Miasma theory, whatever, its flaws offered, something contagion theory initially could not, a visible sensory experience that seemed to support it. Bad smells really were more common in the crowded, unsanitary parts of cities where outbreaks tended to be worst. Foul air was something a person could smell and therefore believe in a way that invisible seeds floating unseen through the air simply could not compete with, not until instruments existed capable of actually revealing them. One of the most consequential responses to grow out of this uncertain, competing landscape of theories emerged not from a physician's treatise at all, but from the pragmatic decisions of merchant city officials trying to protect their trading ports. In the port city of Ragusa along the Adriatic coast in the region, a part of modern Croatia, authorities in the 1370s made a decision that did not require them to understand the true cause of plague at all. They simply required that ships arriving from areas known to be affected by plague wait offshore for a set period before anyone aboard was permitted to enter the city. The number they settled on after some experimentation with shorter periods was 40 days, a figure that may have carried religious significance drawn from various biblical periods of trial and purification lasting 40 days layered onto what was also quite separately a genuinely reasonable, practical window for observing whether illness would emerge among the ship's passengers and crew. This is where the word quarantine actually comes from, derived from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days, and it represents something genuinely important in this story, easy to overlook. It is one of the very first meaningfully effective public health measures in Western history, and it worked at least partially without requiring anyone involved to correctly understand what plague actually was, or how it truly spread. The officials of Ragusa and soon after, Venice and other major trading ports across the Mediterranean had stumbled onto an effective intervention through careful practical observation of patterns, rather than through any theoretical breakthrough at all, echoing something we touched on earlier tonight with willow bark and its quietly effective, poorly understood chemistry. Sometimes in this long and uneven history, doing the right thing and understanding why it was the right thing arrived centuries apart from one another. What this competing landscape of explanations, divine judgment, bad air, invisible seeds of contagion reveals most clearly when we step back and look at it, honestly, is not confusion or foolishness on the part of the people living through it. It reveals something closer to a society reasoning, as carefully as it could within the genuine limits of what was observable to the human eye and mind during this period. The evidence remains incomplete for exactly how ordinary people privately weighed these competing explanations against one another, since surviving written sources tend to reflect the views of educated physicians and clergy far more than they reflect the quiet, unrecorded beliefs of ordinary families sitting up through the night beside a sick child. But what we can say with real confidence is that these three explanations did not simply replace one another in a tidy sequence. They coexisted, argued borrowed from each other, and slowly, unevenly across centuries rather than decades, the balance of belief began to shift very gradually towards the idea that illness was something that moved between bodies, something that might one day be seen clearly enough to finally be understood. That shift would not complete itself quickly, and it would not complete itself gently either. It would take a particular kind of stubborn, quietly heartbreaking persistence from a small handful of individuals willing to trust what they were seeing with their own eyes over what centuries of established authority insisted must be true. And one of those individuals, a physician working in a maternity ward in Vienna, was about to notice something in his own hospital's mortality records that no, before we step into that hospital in Vienna, and we will because it is one of the most important and most quietly heartbreaking stories in this entire history, it is worth pausing to sit with something larger, something almost too easy to walk past amid all the theories and treatments we have covered so far tonight. Behind every fever, every uncertain diagnosis, every confident but mistaken treatment we have discussed, there was always a household, a family absorbing the loss over and over again in a way that shaped the entire emotional architecture of what it meant to live in this era. Consider what an ordinary family across most of pre-modern Europe actually experienced across the span of a single generation. Demographic historians studying parish records across England, France, and much of the rest of the continent have found that in many communities somewhere close to a third of all children died before reaching the age of 10, and in the hardest years following poor harvests or the arrival of disease that number could climb considerably higher. This was not confined to the poor, though poverty made survival harder still. Even wealthy families with access to the very best medical care their era could offer lost children with a regularity that would be almost unthinkable to a parent today. Entire wings of aristocratic family trees simply end in infancy generation after generation, a quiet, patient record of grief written into the branching lines of genealogy charts that most people glance past without ever fully absorbing what they represent. What this meant practically and emotionally is something worth sitting with gently rather than rushing past. Parents in this era loved their children with the same depth and tenderness parents feel today. The historical record makes this abundantly clear in surviving letters filled with genuine anguish in elaborate funeral customs developed specifically for children, in the small, carefully preserved keepsakes, a lock of hair, a christening gown that grieving families kept for the rest of their lives. But alongside that love existed something else, a kind of quiet, necessary emotional bracing that most modern parents will never have to develop, a private acknowledgement that a child's survival to adulthood was never something to be assumed, only something to be hoped for and grieved for again and again if hope did not hold. There is a particular kind of ritual that developed around this reality worth understanding, not as morbid but as deeply quietly human. In many parts of early modern Europe, families did not always name a child immediately at birth, sometimes waiting weeks or even longer, particularly if an earlier child had died young before formally naming the newborn. Some historians studying this pattern suggest it may have functioned as a kind of emotional protection, a way of holding a small, necessary distance during the most dangerous early weeks of an infant's life, though the evidence for the precise emotional reasoning behind this practice remains genuinely difficult to reconstruct with certainty, since the people practicing it rarely wrote down their private reasoning in ways that survive for us to read now. What we do know is that once a child survived those first fragile months, families across this era show every sign of pouring themselves into that child completely, with a devotion that reads across the centuries as entirely familiar and entirely recognizable. Grief itself carried its own visible language during this period, more publicly worn and more communally shared than most modern audiences might expect. Mourning clothing, black or deeply muted in color, was worn for months or sometimes years following a significant loss, and the length and formality of mourning was often carefully calibrated to the relationship, a widow's mourning lasting considerably longer than a more distant relative's, governed by social customs so widely understood that they required little explanation within any given community. Church bells were rung in specific patterns to announce a death, patterns distinct enough that a listener could often tell simply from the rhythm carried across the village roughly how old the person who had died had been, a haunting kind of public accounting that meant an entire community absorbed each loss together almost immediately, whether they had known the person well or not. Here is a detail that tends to surprise people learning about this era, for the first time something easy to overlook amid all the sorrow. Communities facing repeated waves of serious illness developed remarkably sophisticated informal systems of mutual care systems that functioned in their own limited way as something close to social insurance long before any formal institution existed to provide it. In many English and continental villages, neighbours maintained loose but genuine obligations to check on households where illness had struck, to bring food, to help tend animals and fields that a sick or grieving family could not manage alone, to sit through the night with the dying so that no one had to face that passage entirely without company. This was not formalized charity in any institutional sense. It was simply understood as part of what it meant to live closely bound to the people around you, a practical, glamorous kind of resilience built directly out of necessity, since no family, however resourceful, could realistically weather this level of repeated loss entirely alone. It would be a mistake, though, to describe this communal resilience as though it fully softened the underlying reality, and honesty requires resisting that temptation. Repeated loss on this scale left deep and lasting marks visible even now in the historical record in ways that go beyond simple mortality statistics. Some historians studying surviving personal writing from this era, diaries, private letters, the occasional, deeply personal, marginal note left inside a family Bible, have identified patterns of language suggesting something close to what we would now recognize as prolonged grief, a kind of accumulated sorrow carried quietly across years of repeated bereavement. The evidence for this remains genuinely limited, since surviving personal writing from ordinary families rather than the educated elite is relatively rare, and scholars are careful not to overstate conclusions drawn from a necessarily incomplete and skewed sample of sources. But what does survive offers a quiet, powerful reminder that the emotional cost of this era's brutal relationship with illness was carried day after day inside real people's private inner lives, largely without any of the language or support structures we now associate with processing grief. And there is one further layer to this human cost worth sitting with, before we move forward, a layer that connects directly back to something we touched on earlier tonight regarding childbirth. Because the danger of maternal death did not only threaten the mother herself, it reshaped entire households in ways that rippled outward for years afterward. A father left as a sole surviving parent, sometimes remarrying quickly out of practical necessity, rather than choice-blending households, stepchildren and inheritance in patterns that show up again and again across surviving wills and legal records from this period. Older children, sometimes barely more than children themselves, frequently found themselves responsible for raising younger siblings following a mother's death, a quiet, largely unrecorded form of labour and loss that shaped entire childhoods in ways historians are only beginning to fully appreciate as they look more closely at surviving household records, rather than only the medical texts that have traditionally dominated this period's historical study. What emerges from all of this when we step back and consider it together is a picture of an era defined not simply by the presence of illness, which is easy enough to understand in the abstract, but by the sheer repeated frequency with which ordinary people were asked to absorb loss and continue forward regardless. Is it possible to fully imagine what it meant to build a life, a family, a sense of home and continuity, inside a world where that continuity could be interrupted at almost any moment without warning, without any reliable way to prevent it? Perhaps not entirely from where we sit now, with all the advantages of modern medicine surrounding us so completely that we rarely have to think about them at all. But sitting with it honestly, even briefly tonight, offers something worth carrying forward as we continue. Because it is precisely this weight, this accumulated generational cost of illness without answers, that makes what happened next in our story matter as much as it does. Somewhere inside all of this loss, quietly, almost invisibly at first, a small number of people were beginning to look closely enough and carefully enough at what was actually happening around them to start noticing patterns that centuries of accepted medical wisdom had somehow managed to overlook entirely. One of those people was working in a maternity ward in Vienna, watching with a growing and deeply unwelcome sense of unease as mothers in his own care kept dying at rates that made no sense at all once he finally allowed himself to ask the question everyone around him seemed determined to avoid. The Vienna General Hospital in the 1840s runs one of the largest maternity services in Europe, and it is organized for administrative reasons that have nothing to do with medicine into two separate clinics. Women arriving to give birth are assigned to one or the other, essentially by chance depending on the day of the week, and for a long time almost no one thought to ask whether that arbitrary assignment might matter. It mattered enormously. In the first clinic, staffed by physicians and medical students, maternal deaths from childbed fever, the same infection we touched on earlier tonight, ran at a rate that could climb as high as 1 in 10 women in the worst months. In the second clinic, just down the hall, staffed by midwives rather than physicians, the death rate from the same condition was consistently dramatically lower, sometimes less than a third of what the first clinic recorded. Women in Vienna knew this. Expectant mothers begged, sometimes on their knees, according to surviving accounts, to be assigned to the second clinic instead of the first. Some women reportedly chose to give birth in the street rather than risk admission to the more dangerous ward, understanding correctly that arriving too late to be properly assigned might mean ending up somewhere safer almost by accident. This is the situation that greets a young Hungarian physician named Ignaz Semmelweis when he takes up a post at the hospital in 1846. Semmelweis is not by most accounts a particularly celebrated figure within the medical hierarchy of his time, an assistant working under more senior physicians, but he possesses a quality that will end up defining the rest of his difficult, remarkable life. He cannot let the discrepancy between the two clinics go unexamined. Where his colleagues largely accepted the difference as an unfortunate but unexplainable feature of hospital life, Semmelweis begins quietly and methodically trying to find an actual cause. He works through possibility after possibility with real scientific discipline, testing and eliminating explanations one at a time, in a way that feels, reading his own later account of it, almost like watching someone slowly assemble a puzzle in the dark. He considers whether the physician's clinic is simply overcrowded compared to the midwife's clinic. The records do not support it. He considers whether something about the birthing position used in each clinic might explain the difference. It does not hold up either. He even considers, in one of the more genuinely startling threads of this story, whether the presence of a priest who walked directly through the first clinic, ringing a small bell on his way to administer last rites to dying patients, might be somehow frightening other patients into a fatal decline through sheer psychological terror. He tests this too by asking the priest to take a different route and stop ringing the bell. The death rate does not change. The answer, when it finally arrives, comes not from careful clinical reasoning inside the maternity ward at all, but from a tragedy involving one of Semmelweis's own colleagues. A fellow physician performing an autopsy accidentally cuts his own finger with a scalpel that had just been used to examine a patient who died of what appeared to be a severe infection. Within days, the physician himself falls gravely ill, developing symptoms that closely resemble what Semmelweis has been watching kill mothers in the first clinic for months. He dies shortly after, and in the aftermath of this loss, Semmelweis arrives at a realization that will end up defining his entire career, and that history will eventually recognize as one of the single most important insights in the story of modern medicine. The physicians and medical students working in the first clinic spend their mornings performing autopsies in the hospital's dissection rooms, examining the bodies of patients who have died often from the very same childbed fever claiming lives in the maternity ward before walking directly to the maternity clinic to examine living patients without washing their hands in between in any way that we would now recognize as meaningfully thorough. The midwives working in the second clinic had no involvement in autopsy work at all. Semmelweis begins to suspect that the physicians themselves entirely unknowingly are carrying what he describes as cadaverous particles, some invisible material transferred from the bodies of the dead directly into the bodies of living labouring women, on the very hands meant to help deliver them safely. This is in essence an early and remarkably prescient version of what we would now recognize as germ theory, arrived years before anyone had the scientific tools to fully confirm it, built entirely from careful observation and a willingness to follow evidence somewhere deeply uncomfortable. And Semmelweis does something in 1847 that in hindsight feels almost startlingly simple. He orders every physician and medical student under his direction to wash their hands thoroughly in a solution of chlorinated lime before moving from the autopsy room to the maternity ward. The result is immediate and dramatic. Within a matter of months, mortality in the first clinic drops from roughly 1 in 10 to a rate closely matching and in some months actually surpassing the safety of the midwife-run second clinic. By any reasonable modern standard, this is one of the great triumphs of 19th century medicine. A clear, replicable, life-saving intervention discovered through patient observation and confirmed through its own dramatic results. And here is where this story turns from remarkable into something genuinely difficult to sit with, because Semmelweis's colleagues for the most part do not celebrate this discovery. They resist it often with the real hostility. Part of the resistance was genuinely scientific in nature, or at least dressed in scientific language, since Semmelweis, for all his careful observation, struggled for years to explain clearly why his hand-washing protocol worked, lacking any real understanding of microorganisms to point to as the underlying mechanism. Without that explanation, his results, however dramatic, look to many contemporaries almost like a coincidence, an interesting statistical pattern rather than a proven scientific principle. But scholars studying this episode closely have identified something else running underneath the purely scientific objections, something more personal and in its own way more troubling. Semmelweis's findings implied directly and unavoidably that physicians themselves, the most respected and educated men in the entire medical hierarchy, had been unknowingly killing their own patients for years through simple lack of cleanliness. This was not a comfortable idea for a proud hierarchical profession to accept from a relatively junior colleague, and pride, it turns out, can be a remarkably stubborn obstacle even when the evidence in front of it is overwhelming. Semmelweis, for his part, did not handle the resistance gracefully, and honesty about this part to the story matters as much as honouring the scientific insight itself. Frustrated by years of rejection from the medical establishment, he grew increasingly agitated in his public writing and correspondence, at times openly accusing colleagues who refused to adopt his methods of being responsible in effect for the deaths of their patients. This did not win him allies. It deepened the very resistance he was trying to overcome, a genuinely tragic pattern where a correct and urgently important idea became tangled up with the increasingly difficult behavior of the man delivering it, making it easier for his critics to dismiss the message by focusing on the messenger instead. The final chapters of Semmelweis's life carry a weight that is worth sitting with gently rather than rushing past. His mental and physical health declined significantly in the years following his early breakthroughs, and in 1865 he was committed to an asylum where he died just weeks later from an infected wound, in a bitter and almost unbearably ironic echo of the very cause he had spent his career trying to convince others to take seriously. He was around 47 years old. Scholars still debate the exact nature of his final illness and mental decline, with some modern researchers suggesting he may have suffered from an underlying neurological condition that worsened over the final years of his life, though. The historical record from this period is far from complete enough to settle the question with real certainty. It would take roughly 2 more decades after his death for the wider medical establishment to fully accept what Semmelweis had been trying to demonstrate all along. Arriving through the separate but complementary work of other researchers we are going to meet before tonight is through whose findings finally gave the scientific world a way to actually see the microscopic mechanism that Semmelweis had correctly intuited without ever being able to prove. And when that acceptance finally came, historians looking back recognize Semmelweis's Vienna hospital data for what it truly was, one of the clearest, earliest and most quietly heartbreaking examples in the entire history of medicine, of someone arriving at the truth well ahead of the evidence needed to convince anyone else of it. There is something worth carrying forward from this particular story, something that reaches beyond the specific details of hospitals and hand-washing and mortality statistics. It is a reminder of how genuinely difficult it can be for any established system, however well-intentioned, to absorb an uncomfortable truth, even when that truth arrives backed by real measurable evidence. Semmelweis did not fail because his science was wrong. He failed in his own lifetime because the people around him were not yet ready to hear what his evidence was telling them, a pattern that in various forms would echo again in the years just ahead of us tonight as medicine finally slowly began building the tools it needed to see what had been invisible for so long, because not far from Vienna, in a laboratory in France, a chemist who had never formally trained as a physician at all was around this same period beginning a very different set of investigations, ones that would eventually give Semmelweis's forgotten insight the scientific proof it had always deserved and change the entire trajectory of what it meant to fall sick and to actually be helped forever. Louis Pasteur in the 1850s is not investigating human illness at all when he begins the work that will eventually transform medicine forever. He is a chemist hired by French wine producers and brewers who are struggling with a frustrating and expensive problem: batches of wine and beer, spoiling for reasons no one can adequately explain. It is a commercial puzzle, not a medical one, and Pasteur approaches it the way a careful chemist would, examining spoiled liquid under a microscope, looking for whatever might be causing the fermentation to go wrong. What he finds changes the direction of his entire career, and eventually the direction of medicine itself. Under magnification, Pasteur observes that healthy fermentation and spoiled fermentation look distinctly different at the microscopic level, and the difference seems to correspond to the presence of specific tiny organisms invisible to the naked eye, but unmistakable under a lens, contaminating the liquid and interfering with the process. This observation leads Pasteur toward a conclusion that will eventually become one of the foundational principles of modern science, that specific identifiable microorganisms are responsible for specific observable effects rather than spoilage or fermentation arising spontaneously out of nothing, which was remarkably still a widely accepted idea among scientists at the time. It's worth pausing here, because the idea Pasteur is arguing against something called spontaneous generation, the belief that living organisms could simply arise on their own from non-living matter, given the right conditions, had been part of scientific thought since antiquity, taken seriously by educated people for well over 2,000 years. Pasteur's experiments demonstrating that microorganisms in a sterilized liquid only appeared when the liquid was exposed to outside contamination, rather than arising spontaneously within a sealed container, represented a genuinely significant scientific victory, settling a debate that had persisted since long before Hippocrates first began his careful observations on the island of Kos. From this foundation in fermentation and contamination, Pasteur's attention gradually widens toward disease itself, and here his work begins to intersect directly, though he does not fully realize it at first, with the tragic unfinished story of Ignaz Semmelweis in Vienna, where Semmelweis had correctly intuited that some invisible material was passing from the dead to the living on the hands of physicians, without ever being able to identify exactly what that material was. Pasteur, working with more advanced microscopy and a chemist's rigorous experimental method, begins to demonstrate directly that specific microorganisms cause specific diseases, a principle that will eventually become known as germ theory. This shift in understanding did not arrive as a single dramatic announcement accepted overnight, and it is worth being honest about how gradual and contested this transition actually was. Pasteur faced real skepticism from parts of the medical establishment, some of it reasonable scientific caution and some of it rooted in the same kind of professional pride that had made Semmelweis's colleagues so resistant to uncomfortable evidence a decade earlier. But Pasteur possessed something Semmelweis had lacked: a growing body of visible, reproducible laboratory evidence, along with the institutional standing and scientific credibility to have that evidence taken seriously by the broader scientific community. In a way, Semmelweis, working largely alone within a resistant hospital hierarchy, never quite managed to achieve during his own lifetime. While Pasteur worked in France, a Scottish surgeon named Joseph Lister was independently confronting the same underlying problem from an entirely different angle, standing at the operating table rather than the laboratory bench. Lister, working in Glasgow in the 1860s, was deeply troubled by something every surgeon of his era simply accepted as an unavoidable feature of their profession: the fact that a significant proportion of patients who survived surgery itself would go on to die in the days afterward from infections that developed in the surgical wound, infections doctors at the time often referred to as hospital gangrene or ward fever, without any real understanding of what actually caused them. When Lister encountered Pasteur's published research on microorganisms and their role in fermentation and decay, something clicked into place for him in a way that had not clicked into place for most of his surgical colleagues reading the same material. If invisible organisms could cause wine to spoil, Lister reasoned, might similar organisms be responsible for wound spoiling as well, festering and turning fatal in ways that had nothing to do with the miasma theory or humoral imbalance that still dominated most surgical thinking of the period. It was in its own way exactly the kind of careful, willing to be uncomfortable reasoning that had defined Semmelweis's work in Vienna, arriving this time from a surgeon with scientific evidence and institutional standing to make the argument stick. Lister began experimenting with carbolic acid, a chemical already in limited use for treating sewage, applying it directly to surgical wounds, surgical instruments, and even spraying it into the air of the operating theatre itself during procedures in an effort to kill whatever invisible organisms might be present before they had a chance to infect the wound. The results, much like Semmelweis's hand-washing protocol in Vienna 20 years earlier, were dramatic and immediate. Mortality rates in Lister's surgical wards from post-operative infection dropped substantially in some reported cases, by more than half, a change significant enough that it became increasingly difficult for skeptical colleagues to dismiss as coincidence. And yet remarkably, Lister's early findings met with resistance that echoed Semmelweis's experience in some genuinely striking ways, a detail that surprises many people learning this story for the first time. Some surgeons found the idea of invisible organisms causing infection simply implausible, given how little direct evidence anyone could actually see with the naked eye. Others resisted for more practical reasons, since Lister's antiseptic method required a significant change in surgical habit and added considerable time and inconvenience to procedures that surgeons had performed the same way for their entire careers. It would take roughly 2 more decades of accumulating evidence, along with the gradual hard-won acceptance of Pasteur's broader germ theory across the wider scientific and medical community, before antiseptic surgical technique became a standard, unquestioned part of medical practice rather than a controversial innovation defended primarily by the person who invented it. There is a genuine scholarly debate worth acknowledging honestly here, regarding exactly how much credit belongs to Lister individually versus the broader wave of researchers working across Europe during this Same remarkable period, since several other surgeons and scientists were independently arriving at similar conclusions about sterile technique around the same years, working somewhat in parallel with limited direct communication between them. What historians generally agree on is that this period, roughly the 1860s through the 1880s, represents one of the single most consequential stretches in the entire history of medicine. A relatively short span of decades during which the invisible mechanism behind centuries of unexplained death finally became visible enough and provable enough to actually change how medicine was practiced at its most fundamental level. While germ theory was slowly reshaping how physicians understood infection, a separate and equally transformative breakthrough was unfolding on the other side of the operating table, addressing not why wounds became infected, but the sheer unbearable experience of surgery itself that we spent time with earlier tonight. In October of 1846, in an operating theatre at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, a dentist named William Morton administered a compound called ether to a patient about to undergo the removal of a tumour from his neck. The patient remarkably remained unconscious and free of pain throughout the entire procedure, waking afterward with, according to the surviving accounts, genuine astonishment that the completed. This moment, sometimes referred to by medical historians as Ether Day, represents one of the most immediately and universally celebrated breakthroughs in this entire history. A striking contrast to the slow, grudging acceptance that met Semmelweis and initially Lister as well. News of effective surgical anesthesia spread across the medical world within months, rather than decades, adopted with an eagerness that reflects just how desperately physicians and patients alike had been waiting, whether they fully realized it or not, for exactly this kind of relief. Within a remarkably short period, the fully conscious amputation we described earlier. Tonight, timed by the surgeon's speed alone, became a thing of the past across most of the developed medical world, replaced by a patient sleeping peacefully through a procedure that only a few years earlier would have represented one of the most physically traumatic experiences a person could survive. It is worth sitting with why anesthesia found such swift acceptance while antiseptic technique and Semmelweis's hand-washing protocol faced such stubborn resistance, because the contrast reveals something quietly important about how medical change actually happens. Anesthesia offered something immediately, visibly, undeniably obvious to everyone present in the operating theatre. A patient who had been screaming now lying peacefully still. Germ theory and antiseptic technique, by contrast, asked physicians to accept the existence and influence of something they could not see or feel with their own senses based on statistical evidence and laboratory demonstration rather than immediate visceral experience. Human beings, it turns out, tend to trust what they can directly witness far more readily than what they must take on the strength of careful reasoning and accumulated data alone. A pattern that shows up again and again throughout this entire history, and arguably still shapes how new medical evidence is received even now. By the final decades of the 1800s, these separate threads, Pasteur's germ theory, Lister's antiseptic surgery, and the arrival of effective anesthesia were finally converging into something that would have seemed almost unimaginable to a physician practicing only a generation or two earlier. Surgery that was both survivable in the moment and far less likely to prove fatal in the days afterward. An understanding of disease grounded in visible, provable biological mechanism rather than centuries-old theories of bodily balance. And quietly vindicated at last the forgotten insight of a Hungarian physician in Vienna who had seen the truth clearly enough to save lives with nothing more than clean hands, and had died still, largely unheard years before the rest of the world finally caught up to what he had been trying to tell them all along. None of this arrived as a single finished victory, and it would be its own kind of dishonesty to suggest that the story simply resolves neatly here. Effective treatments for many of history's deadliest infections, the kind of medicine that could actually cure, rather than merely explain, remain decades away, even after germ theory finally took hold. But something fundamental had shifted, a genuine turning point after which the trajectory of medicine bends slowly but unmistakably toward the world we now quietly take for granted. And as that trajectory continues forward into the 20th century, it carries with it not just new discoveries but the quiet, lingering traces of everything that came before, echoes still visible, if you know where to look in the language, the customs, and even the small daily habits of the world we live in now. Something curious happens in the decades following Pasteur and Lister, easy to miss unless you go looking for it directly, and it has to do with penicillin, a discovery most people already know in broad outline, but rarely in the fuller, stranger detail of how it actually unfolded. In September of 1928, a Scottish bacteriologist named Alexander Fleming returns to his cluttered London laboratory after a family holiday to find that one of his petri dishes, left uncovered and forgotten among a pile of others before he departed, has grown a patch of blue-green mould, and that the bacteria surrounding that mould has quite strikingly died off. Fleming was not searching for anything resembling a cure when this happened. He was, by his own later accounts, simply a somewhat untidy researcher, returning to a messy bench, and the discovery of what would become penicillin was, in the most literal sense, an accident, one that very nearly went unnoticed entirely. What makes this detail worth sitting with is not just the element of chance, though, that alone is remarkable, but what happened afterward, or rather, what did not happen for a surprisingly long stretch of time. Fleming published his observations, but lacked the chemistry background and institutional resources to purify the substance into something usable as an actual treatment, and for more than a decade his discovery sat largely dormant, referenced occasionally in scientific literature, but not meaningfully developed into medicine. It would take a separate team of researchers at Oxford, working under the pressure of wartime necessity in the early 1940s, to finally transform Fleming's chance observation into a stable, mass-producible drug arriving just in time to treat wounded soldiers during the Second World War on a scale that would have seemed like pure fantasy to a physician practicing only a generation earlier. There is something worth pausing on here, a thread that connects all the way back to where we began tonight. From Hippocrates first proposing that illness had natural rather than supernatural causes, to Fleming's overlooked mould nearly 2,500 years past, and across almost all of that span the fundamental relationship between a sick body and the people trying to help it changes remarkably little. And then within the span of less than a single century, roughly from Pasteur's early experiments through the mass production of antibiotics during the 1940s, the relationship transforms almost entirely. Scholars studying the history of medicine still debate exactly why this acceleration happened when it did, whether it reflects the accumulated weight of germ theory finally reaching a tipping point, the pressures of industrialization and scientific institution building, or simply a kind of compounding effect where each new discovery made the next one easier to reach. Most likely it was some combination of all three, though untangling the precise proportions remains an active area of historical and scientific inquiry. What this compressed, accelerated ending means practically is something worth genuinely absorbing, because it reframes almost everything we have spent tonight walking through together. If you consider the full span of recorded human history, reliable evidence-based treatment for serious infection has existed for what amounts to a tiny sliver of time, a matter of decades rather than centuries, tucked into the very end of an extraordinarily long story defined mostly by uncertainty, improvisation and hard-won incomplete understanding. Someone born in the 1800s could easily have lived through the era of Semmelweis's forgotten insight, Pasteur's early experiments, Lister's contested antiseptic method, and still died decades before antibiotics existed to treat a simple bacterial infection that today would be resolved with a short course of medication picked up at any ordinary pharmacy. And yet for all this dramatic transformation, echoes of the older world we spent tonight exploring have not entirely vanished, and this is where the story becomes genuinely fascinating to trace. Language carries some of the clearest fossils. We already touched on melancholy drawn directly from the ancient theory of black bile, still used casually today by people who have likely never heard of Hippocrates or Galen at all. But there are others quieter and easier to miss. The phrase in good humour or out of sorts both descend directly from humoral theory references to a person's internal balance of bodily fluids that most modern speakers use without any awareness of where the words originally came from. Even the modern medical symbol most people recognise instantly a staff with a single serpent wound around it traces back to ancient Greek mythology and the god Asclepius, a visual lineage connecting the gleaming, sterile hospitals of today directly back to temples of healing that stood on the same soil where Hippocrates once walked. Certain physical structures of modern medicine carry these older traces too, sometimes in ways that surprise people who encounter them for the first time. The Red Cross, recognized globally today as a symbol of medical aid and humanitarian assistance, was deliberately chosen in the 1860s partly as a visual inversion of the flag of Switzerland, the home country of the organization's founder. But its color and simple form also drew on centuries of earlier tradition using red as a marker for places offering aid to the sick and wounded, a visual language with roots reaching back well before the modern organization that formalized it. And we already spent time earlier tonight with the barber's pole, still spinning quietly outside barber shops in cities all over the world, a small, mostly unnoticed monument to an entire vanished profession of barber surgeons who once set bones and pulled teeth alongside trimming hair. Some of the older era's genuine medical insight buried for centuries under theory that eventually proved mistaken also survived in more substantial and directly useful ways than most people realize. We touched on willow bark earlier and its distant chemical relationship to modern aspirin, but the pattern repeats across an entire category of modern pharmaceuticals. A significant proportion of medications still used today trace their active compounds back to plants first used by traditional healers, working entirely within frameworks we would now consider scientifically outdated, sometimes centuries or even millennia before modern chemistry could explain exactly why those remedies worked. Digitalis, a heart medication still prescribed today in certain forms, derives from foxglove, a plant used cautiously in folk medicine for generations before an English physician named William Withering conducted the careful clinical observation in the late 1700s that finally connected the plant's traditional use to a legitimate, explainable medical benefit. It is a pattern worth noticing, this quiet thread of genuine wisdom running underneath centuries of flawed theory, easy to dismiss entirely if you focus only on what people got wrong, and easy to romanticize entirely if you focus only on what they happened to get right. There is a genuinely surprising detail connected to Semmelweis worth returning to here, one that adds a final, quietly moving layer to his story. Today, hospitals around the world observe something informally referred to in some medical education circles as Semmelweis reflex, a term describing the human tendency to reflexively reject new evidence that contradicts established belief, named directly after the physician whose own life became perhaps history's clearest illustration of exactly that pattern. It is a strange kind of legacy being remembered not only for a genuine life-saving discovery, but for the very human failure of the people around you to accept it transformed generations later into a permanent, cautionary term still used to remind modern medical students of exactly how easily good evidence can be dismissed by minds too certain of what they already believe to be true. Is it fair to say that modern medicine has fully outgrown that tendency, the same reflexive resistance that cost Semmelweis so dearly during his own lifetime? Most historians of science would gently caution against that conclusion. Medical history across the 20th century contains its own quieter echoes of the same pattern. Researchers whose findings were initially dismissed before eventually being vindicated. Institutions slow to adopt evidence that challenged established practice. A reminder that the underlying human tendencies running through tonight's entire story did not simply end when the microscope finally revealed what centuries of physicians had been unable to see with the naked eye. What perhaps matters most looking back across the full sweep of everything we have walked through together tonight is not simply cataloguing what changed, though the changes themselves are genuinely extraordinary, but sitting honestly with what this history reveals about how change actually happens at all. It rarely arrives as a single dramatic moment, however much our modern retellings like to compress it into one. It arrives instead through centuries of careful, often unrewarded observation, through individuals like Semmelweis, who saw clearly and paid a terrible personal cost for it, through accidents like Fleming's forgotten petri dish, through institutions slowly, reluctantly letting go of certainty they had held for generations, and through countless ordinary people, physicians and midwives and grieving parents alike, quietly doing the best they could with whatever understanding was available to them in their own particular moment in time. There is a particular kind of comfort available in sitting with this longer view, even amid everything genuinely difficult we have covered together tonight, because it means that every advance we now take entirely for granted, clean surgical instruments, effective anesthesia, antibiotics that can resolve in days what once took weeks or claimed lives entirely was built quite literally on the accumulated weight of centuries of people who never lived to see the world their careful observations would eventually help create. Agnes, from the very beginning of tonight's story, kneeling beside her feverish son in that small stone cottage, could not have known that her son's illness was part of a story stretching forward across hundreds of years, connecting eventually to laboratories in Paris and operating theatres in Glasgow, and a forgotten petri dish in London. But in a very real sense, every person who lived through this long history, whether they survived their own illness or did not, became part of the slow, patient accumulation of understanding that eventually made survival for so many of us now something we barely have to think about at all. And that quiet accumulated inheritance carried forward across so many centuries of uncertainty and loss and hard-won discovery brings us finally to where this long story is ready to rest in the kind of stillness that only arrives after everything essential has already been said. There is a museum in Vienna today, not far from where the old General Hospital once stood, that keeps a small collection of medical instruments from the 1800s. Among them sits a plain glass basin and a chipped enamel pitcher, unremarkable to look at, easy to walk past without a second glance. A small placard beside them explains briefly that instruments like these were used for a chlorinated lime hand-washing solution, part of a protocol introduced by a physician whose name most visitors do not recognize, and whose colleagues in his own lifetime largely ignored him. People stand in front of that basin every day now, entirely unaware that they are looking at one of the objects that help make it possible for them to walk into any hospital in the world today and reasonably expect to walk back out again. That is in many ways the truest shape of everything we have spent tonight walking through together. Not a single dramatic turning point, but centuries of quiet cumulative effort. Most of it unrecognized in its own time, most of its authors gone long before the world caught up to what they had actually understood. Agnes kneeling beside her son in that stone cottage at the very beginning of tonight's story could not have known she was standing at the start of a chain reaching all the way to that basin in Vienna, to Pasteur's laboratory, to a forgotten petri dish in London. And that perhaps is the quiet, aching truth sitting underneath this entire history. Almost no one living through it ever got to see how the story turned out. They simply lived their piece of it as fully and as bravely as they could, and then the story moved on without them. We have spent tonight sitting with the four humours and with the physicians who bled their patients in complete good faith, believing they were restoring balance rather than draining life away. We have stood in the port at Messina as 12 ships carried something no medical theory of the age could name. We have watched a French military surgeon abandon boiling oil simply because he ran out of it one difficult night and happened to notice quietly that his patients healed better without it. We have sat in an archive room built of parish ledgers and old bones evidence left behind, not by physicians who understood what was happening, but by ordinary clerks and ordinary skeletons patiently, silently keeping the truth safe until someone finally knew how to read it. We have grieved with families who buried far more children than any family should ever have to bury, and who kept loving and kept trying again and again, because there was truly nothing else to do but continue. We have watched Ignaz Semmelweis see the truth with total clarity and watched the world around him refuse it and watched him die, still largely unheard in an asylum, from the very kind of infection his own discovery could have prevented had anyone been willing to listen while he was still alive to explain it. What connects all of this across so many centuries and so many different kinds of suffering is something quieter than tragedy, and quieter than triumph too. It is the sheer unglamorous persistence of people who kept trying anyway. Physicians working with theories that were wrong, but working carefully, sincerely, doing the very best they knew how to do with what little they had. Mothers who sat up through fevered nights they could not cure, offering the only medicine actually available to them, their own steady, unwavering presence. Midwives who learn generation after generation purely by watching and doing, carrying forward a kind of practical wisdom no university of the time thought to take seriously. None of them knew while they were living it whether any of it would eventually matter. They simply kept showing up for the people in front of them because that is in the end what caring for another person actually requires. Whether or not you have any real power to fix what is wrong, this is where a history like this one earns its weight, not in the scale of the numbers staggering as they often are, but in what it quietly asks of us now on the other side of it. It asks us to notice how recently in the full span of human time real relief actually arrived. It asks us to hold some genuine tenderness for every physician who bled a patient believing it would help, for every mother who lost a child she loved, exactly as fiercely as any mother loves a child today. For every person who suffered through an illness that medicine now resolves quietly, almost without a second thought. None of them were foolish. They were only early born into a chapter of the story where the answers had not yet arrived, doing what all of us are ultimately doing in our own moment, working with the understanding available to us, hoping it is enough, rarely certain that it is. And there is something in that uncertainty worth sitting with gently rather than resolving too neatly. Because, truth, we are not so different now. We simply stand a little further down the same long road carrying tools that Agnes and Semmelweis and Pasteur could never have imagined, but still in the end doing the same essentially human thing they were always doing, tending to each other, watching over the people we love as closely and as carefully as we know how, in a world that remains in ways large and small, never entirely within our control. Let the pace slow now, the way it always does toward the end of a long night. Somewhere centuries ago, a physician set down his blade after a long day and washed his hands without knowing why it mattered, only that it seemed somehow like the right thing to do. Somewhere a mother rocked a child through a fever that eventually broke and never learned the name of what had caused it, only that morning came and her son was still breathing. Somewhere a clerk in a small parish church dipped his pen and wrote a single line in a ledger no one would read again for 400 years, not knowing that his careful, ordinary handwriting would one day help someone finally understand what his whole village had lived through. None of them saw the ending. They only lived their part of it quietly the best way they knew how. We are all of us living our part of it too. Somewhere tonight, in a warm room, a light left on low, someone is finally letting go of a long day. The story does not end here. It only rests.